Welcome to Human Tech, a podcast about humans, science, technology, and the way human behavior interacts with science and technology. With me, as always, is Dr. Susan Weinschenk. Hello.
Hello.
And today we actually have a very special guest with us. Our first guest, our inaugural guest, as it were, is Paul Zak, president of Zest X Labs. Hello, Paul.
Hi, Guthrie.
So, just so the audience knows a little bit, why don't you tell us what you've been up to?
Oh, mostly no good. I'm a professor also at Claremont Graduate University, and this last year we spun out a company called Zest X Labs to help optimize consumer experiences from marketing to user experiences online to in-store shopping experiences. And that's been a labor of love and a labor.
Great. Yeah, so for those who don't know, Paul has done some really, really amazing research, and we've actually talked a bit on this podcast about some of the research he's done.
That's right. We talked about it because we did the story podcast, didn't we?
Yes.
And then I always talk about Paul's book, The Moral Molecule, when I'm talking about stories. So, yeah, Paul, we've already talked about you. And then we decided, we decided we better have you on so you could clear up your name and reputation after the.
That's right. No. I knew it.
No, just kidding. So I'm really excited. This is our first guest. So I'm really excited to have Paul on. I've been a fan and following his work. And this is the first time I'm really going to get to talk in depth about the work he's done. Paul, you and I have had a phone conversation that was, I don't know, fairly in depth, but that was more getting to know each other rather than necessarily talking about the work. So we were talking before we started the podcast about maybe starting with talking about the science of creativity, which is like one of my favorite topics. So I would love to hear about what you've been finding out about, quantifying creativity.
Which sounds almost like an oxymoron to a lot of people. So I know you have this experience, and I do. When you work with creatives who are making this content, there's something kind of magical happens. And you've had it, and I've had it too, where you're writing or you're creating something, and all of a sudden the muse speaks to you, or you get an inspiration, or you have an epiphany, and something kind of beautiful happens. The problem is that it's very difficult to recreate those factors, but also to separate yourself from that process. So we've done a lot of work on advertising, in which when you look at the commercial, you go, say a TV commercial, you think, man, the creatives were they had the right idea and this did not work. And the problem is, when does it not work? And I can give you some examples of that and also stuff that works. It's very difficult to know because, again, when you're creating this yourself, you're so enthusiastic about it. It's like your own writing or your own research. I always say if you spend 2 weeks working at anything by yourself, everything looks brilliant because after 2 weeks, you've convinced yourself it's the most interesting thing in the world. So how do we actually get into understand what it is about a creative endeavor that makes it valuable? And for people who have to pay the bills, eventually we need a client to pay for this, or we need someone to purchase our time. So as you know, we've done a lot of work on persuasion for the U.S. Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and we've used all this knowledge to create a set of platforms and algorithms in which we can quantify the impact in terms of persuasion, that is, motivating people to take an action of a creative creation. Wow, that's a wrong word. Of a creative endeavor, of an advertising, a commercial, an experience, a location, a physical space, and I think that's useful. So it doesn't completely quantify creativity, but it quantifies to the extent that the humans are really immersed in this experience, and when they're immersed in it, then you're likely to be able to influence them to take some action.
So that's how so when you talk about quantifying creativity, you're talking about, can we measure the amount of engagement. Let's use that word for a second, and then of course we have to, you have to tell us how you quantify that. But can we measure the amount of engagement of the person who's interacting with this thing we created, whether it be a TV commercial or a movie or whatever? Is that what you mean?
Correct. So again, we want to take the kind of self-report out of this and just query the brain to see from a neurologic perspective the degree of engagement, which we can define. And part of that is that engagement is very difficult to articulate. So the simple example I think I gave you when we talked on the phone was, if I ask you or Guthrie, why do you like chocolate ice cream more than vanilla? That why question is really complicated, right? It's a very, you can tell me you like chocolate more than vanilla. So the why, I don't know. I don't
feeling.
know. Your dad bought it. Yeah, it's a feeling. It seems right. And once in a while you buy vanilla, right? Which is even more complicated. So, so the question is why? And I think, as opposed to relying on people's very flawed ability to report their inner feeling states, we can actually measure that neurologically and then just take that, that reporter out of the brain. And it also gets away from things like what psychologists call, so socially acceptable answers, right? So we do a lot of work to test our algorithms against ads that have been rated by lots of people, like Super Bowl ads, which gets a lot of ratings. And if you put a gratuitous puppy in a commercial, everyone says they love it. But if it doesn't have an effective storyline, if the story's not connected to the product, it turns out that the brain is not very convinced by that. So, what people say they like and what really is immersive and engaging for them often are different things.
So, Paul, I have a question for you. How are you measuring this then?
Right. So there's the long answer and the short answer. So I'll do the midpoint. So we spent about 10 years running a series of experiments where we measured neurochemical changes. We infused drugs into people to turn on and off parts of the brain.
That's awesome.
To really map out how this story immersion system works. And it's based on work we have done that was reported in the Moral Molecule on human connection. And so we spent a lot of time, asking prior to this work, why humans are ever nice to each other when they're strangers, and identifying the neurologic signals that tell us that someone else is safe or interesting or someone we want to interact with. And then we applied that to storytelling, communications, and immersive experiences that involve other people, like shopping at a store. Anyway, so it took a long time, and now we actually use wireless sensors on the torso and fingers and head, in which we collect data 1,000 times a second. We get gigabytes of data out of people's brains, and we've refined over a period of time a set of measures and algorithms that identify the degree of story immersion. So the company's called Zest X Labs because we derived this algorithm we call Zest that tells you how much zest this ad has. And so it's a linear measure. So this commercial has a zest of 3 and another one has a zest of 6. The commercial with 6 is twice as immersive and therefore much more likely to motivate a consumer to take an action.
So you spent all this time figuring out kind of what the landmarks and signals are for these particular measures of engagement in the brain, and then you can measure that while they're watching something, and if the two line up, that's what's going on.
Yeah, and we always focus on actions. So,
okay.
What we don't want to do is just say, hey, do you like this commercial? Do you think it's persuasive? Again, neurologically, I don't know what liking really means. It's poorly defined. So we want to talk about these immersion measures. So let me tell you what they are, and I'm happy to share them because anyone who's listening can also measure these, but to actually get them to work together is complicated. So because we were doing this work, particularly for the Department of Defense, in which they wanted to have very robust measures that could work not just in a nice, quiet laboratory, but particularly in out in the field and potentially nasty areas. So we use multiple measures of attention to communication, and attention is the first thing you have to get. So the brain doles out resources very efficiently, and if something's not interesting, you just don't pay attention to it because attention costs calories to run, and your brain wants to save calories. So the first thing is to measure attention in multiple ways. But the second and really the key part for motivating action is emotional resonance with the story or the experience. So an example of this is when you're watching the opening of a James Bond movie, and James Bond is dodging bullets as he's running across a roof to save the girl, and your palms begin to sweat. Well, you're reflecting the emotions of the character in that movie, and if it's a really good movie or communication or commercial, you'll continue to have this kind of emotional resonance with the characters. And then essentially, as social creatures, our brains have this sort of monkey see, monkey do effect, which is you say, well, apparently the humans are now dodging bullets. I'm a human. I should also consider dodging bullets. In case you didn't know, that was a thing to do when people are shooting at you. So stories teach us things. And the reason we become immersed in novels and movies and TV shows is because it tells us something about the human condition, in the best case. And even a 30-second commercial can tell us something about the human condition, which is valuable. And I could give you a couple examples of that. But when you see a really well-crafted story, people have these physiologic responses. And as humans, we say, oh, apparently this is such a compelling story that this is what the humans are doing. I should sort of follow that as well. Again, it's not a one-to-one, but the more you see that, the more you make the case that this is important. Like a great documentary you may have seen, or even a great movie, right? You've seen this movie, and you're really committed now to, I don't know, caring about killer whales, or worrying about where your sushi comes from. So movies really can change our attitudes, opinions, behaviors. And the question is, what are the signals that do that? And that's what we've spent 10 years and about $3 million. A lot of that, your tax money, figuring out.
All right, wait a minute. So what are the signals? Because you said you have these. You've got people strapped up. You're doing these measurements outside. So what does it look like physiologically when someone is paying attention and has that resonance?
Right. It's a great question. And we think of in the brain as kind of having a gas pedal and a brake pedal. And the gas pedal we call sympathetic arousal. This is higher heart rate, sweating, increased activity in things like prefrontal cortex. At the same time, there's the brake pedal, which is called parasympathetic activity, reduces that tension and allows us to be more restful, more calm. And what we find in these highly immersive situations is that the gas and the brake are simultaneously on. This is a really unusual situation. It's a kind of focused relaxation. So you're paying attention to the stimulus, but you're also really open to the responses that your body's having. You're not suppressing that. You're not emotionally regulating. You're feeling what you think those characters are feeling. Again, we're getting 6 different measures of this to make sure that we're really capturing, what is really going on in your brain. And often we'll supplement that with other measures like eye tracking for visual attention. But this overall Zest measure, according to the DoD, Department of Defense, has been shown to be, more than 80% accurate at predicting what people will do after they watch or view a communication. So that's pretty darn good.
Boy, that's pretty strange. That's really strange that the gas and the breaker is on at the same time.
So I should say that. So Susan's a scientist. She knows this work. But for the non-scientists listening, or for the scientists listening, they're not actually simultaneously on. They're
kind of going back and forth.
They go back and forth. So you actually maintain this balance where it's on, off, on, off, on, off, which is a really interesting situation. So you can think of this as like this work that Richie Davison has done at Wisconsin, one of your neighbors.
I know, and I don't know him personally, but I definitely know of his work.
Yeah, so he studied long-term Buddhist monks, long-term meditators,
Yes.
or Buddhist monks, and you see this sort of focused attention where you see a reduction in things like prefrontal activity, where the brain is kind of relaxed. On the other hand, you're really present. You're really focused on the here and now. And so it's for storytelling, this has been called narrative transportation. So, the narrative is so compelling that you are transported into that world. And it's super weird that humans can do this. And we're probably the only animals that do it, in which you give me enough stimulation and all of a sudden my brain projects me into a world in which I don't live. And that is really interesting.
Well, this is especially interesting because we've been doing a lot of this podcast, especially. We basically started, like the week we started, all these things are just kind of coming into place. For example, all these virtual reality headsets are coming out of dev and are now completely available. We have all this like deep learning stuff that's going on that's going to allow humans to kind of interact with virtual worlds in a way that they were not able to before. So I'm very curious. I mean, I don't want to get too far off topic, but just as an interesting side point, especially with virtual reality, if you watch the videos, right, they strap on the headset, and there's one where they're using there's a new potential like therapeutic version. So people who are scared of heights, they have a big room and they have a wooden board, and on the virtual reality headset there's a board that's going out of a skyscraper, and they have like fans blowing so you can feel the wind, and at the end of the board in virtual reality is a small kitten, and you have to get to the end of the board to save the kitten. And you watch the video and these people are just they're absolutely terrified. They're completely in that place. But of course, if they fall, right, they just fall on soft padding. But they're completely there. But then when they do save the kitten, everyone's very happy.
Yeah. So Paul, what do you think about? I mean, I don't know if you've been doing any measurements yet with people who are immersed in virtual reality rather than watching, for instance, a commercial or video. But what do you, if you haven't done that work up to this point, what do you think would be, is the reaction physiologically similar, do you think? Or will we find something totally different when we do those measurements?
So the question is so appropriate. We actually just finished a pilot of people in a virtual reality world. And, we found very similar reactions. What we were looking at primarily is whether people became acclimated to that world. So when you first, I don't know if you guys have tried this, when you first put on these goggles, particularly when you have a rich, world to explore, you're looking at the ceiling, you're looking at the sky. It's, you're kind of distracted because it is very immersive. I should say for listeners who haven't tried it, that the technology is just a little behind the computing power where it still feels like you're watching, a very kind of in the round movie. It's a movie, but it becomes immersive. So the first test we wanted to do is just, do people relax and stop looking around? Do they physiologically feel like they're just in this space? And the first answer to that is yes. So that's kind of good news for the virtual reality makers. But I think to Guthrie's point, there's as this technology gets better and it becomes more difficult to differentiate between the actual world and a virtual world. I think as Guthrie suggested, the brain doesn't really care which world it's in. I mean, this is like why we cry at movies. I mean, you're in a movie theater, you know where you are, you're cognitively intact, and yet when the boy gets the girl at the end, you're crying. That's actually, again, really unusual from a brain perspective. So I think the virtual worlds have the opportunity to really ramp up that immersion in the story. So maybe there are people who become addicted to that. Their virtual world is so engaging, they don't want to come out of the virtual world and go back into the real world where things are messier.
And for our listeners, this is not some crazy out in the future thing. Right now, you do virtual reality at about 1080p. Probably 4 or 5 years, you'll be able to be in virtual reality at 4K resolutions with 120 hertz refresh rate. That will be essentially, you will not be able to distinguish as long as you have high enough content resolutions of the surroundings that you're in. Or even if you can film a space, for example, with 3D movies, you'll be able to film like a forest, and you'll be able to walk around the forest and basically look at everything at full resolution. So maybe 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, it may be really, really hard to differentiate when you put on virtual reality what you're looking at compared to when you take the headset off. Whereas now, again, I've tried it, and it is quite the experience. Probably very similar to the first time people, when a moving picture first came out, and it was just like nothing your brain even knew what to do with. But you can you can see the pixels, you can see the textures. But in a couple years, not so much.
It'll be great. And I think once we add in the haptics, which are getting much, much better now, where you can feel things, you're getting this somatic feedback, I think it's going to be even more immersive. Mm-hmm. I think for the creatives listening out there and people creating content, one of the most interesting things is how storytelling is changing in that virtual world. So once, the viewer can create his or her own story, then I think the richness of storytelling increases, but also the opportunity to get lost in the wrong way in a story changes. So I think one of the models will be in the video game industry where you can choose your own route through this, say, massively online game, but at the same point, you have guideposts, you have individuals, you have avatars that are kind of guiding you on what the right path is. So I think it opens up a whole new realm of immersion for consumers, for advertisers, and for content creators.
So the other thing, especially when you talk about advertisers, that I don't know how people are going to get around. So right now, you're watching TV and an ad comes on, right? And it's, there's a box on your TV and the ad comes on, and unless you really take an effort to, if you have TiVo, that's why people love it, so they can pause and then fast forward through the commercials. You basically have to watch that content because your TV is in front of you. So the real problem is you're watching a 3D movie or you're watching an advertisement in a 3D space, but particularly a movie, right? So it's like you're there, right? And the characters are doing their dialogue and like kind of in front of you, and you can walk around them. Well, what happens when the person watching gets bored and decides to just wander off? Mm-hmm. Or the advertisers are trying to show like a scene, right? And you're like in the scene, you can see the pets doing the thing, and you're like, this is boring, and you walk out the door. I'm not sure how you can, with a TV, it's easy to keep the user's focus in one spot because you're controlling the pipe and the motion and what's going on. But in virtual reality, I'm not sure how you fix that.
But then there's the richness of storytelling. I think movie makers, by the way, all the major movie studios now have VR divisions, and to be very soon in which all the movies will be released in VR as well. So, that's going there. But it really requires rich storytelling where you want to find out what happens to the protagonist. You want to find out if the bad guy gets his comeuppance at the end. And so you've got to really build this kind of rich story structure. But you're right, Guthrie, there's going to be kind of waypoints in which you can change your story. So it could be that now I get to watch whatever the biggest movie now is, Superman versus Batman, and I can watch it 20 times because there's 20 different versions of that movie because I get to choose the route through the movie. I get to choose, which route they go. So from an advertiser or from a content creator perspective, once we figure out how to nail this so that you have routes and they branch off and they don't branch in an infinite number of ways because that's just unwieldy, then, you really have a very compelling experience. And for some reason, I never used to watch, when I was younger, I never used to watch movies a second or third time. But now I have movies, because apparently I'm old, as my kids say. I have movies that I've seen 5, 6, 7, 8 times, and I really enjoy them. If they're great movies, you see so many layers that once you understand the story, you really appreciate how richly these were designed. So I can imagine in the VR movie world or advertising world where there are just layers and layers, and you may want to watch that ad for, Dove soap, because every time you watch it, it actually changes. It's evolving. And maybe from a neuroscience perspective, it's evolving as you watch it. So I know more about you. I'm picking up your physiologic signals through the headset you're wearing, which is definitely in the future. And so now I get to actually create a better story for you and you dig it more. And again, whether you do or do not buy Dove soap depends on, do you like Dove soap? Do you buy it? Does it give you a rash? I mean, all kinds of things. But at least from a commercial perspective, I think we can really do a lot more targeting where we're not getting crap commercials that I don't care about that have nothing to do with me. The base level of that's like Hulu or other places that give you this kind of, is this commercial relevant to you?
Right.
But I think once we're in the VR world and I'm already touching your head, I can get brain activity. So, we're definitely thinking about that. I think we're not there yet, but eventually it'll be, you have a glove on, you have VR goggles on, and I just optimize the story for you between what you're interested in and how your brain's responding to it.
So, I mean, because it takes a lot more effort to make that extra content. But video games have been doing this for years. A normal video game, it's about 60 hours just to go walk through it once, and there's all these different things you can do and side quests and kind of go on and on. And the thing about kind of engagement, I remember when the Xbox Kinect, the second one, came out. They're like, this is so it's so sensitive. We'll be able to tell if the person is actually engaged in the game. And so if the person gets bored, right, then the bosses start getting harder to bring them back in. But of course, that's probably nothing compared to having something strapped on your head that can get live brain activity feedback.
Right.
Okay, if you could see me on video, I'm like, my eyes are getting bigger. And my head is starting to shake. No. Yeah, no, it's a little overwhelming. All right, I have some questions for you. So, when if we just talk about commercials or movies or video or even just audio, pre-virtual reality, right? Then we can talk about, for instance, the how having a well-constructed story and having well-defined characters. I'm assuming, and Paul, you can tell us whether that increases engagement. So there's this idea of you can tell a story well, and you can have good characters, and you can do certain things to make the story more engaging. When we talk about now going into the VR space with all of this, I'm kind of imagining that there's going to be this, and maybe I'm wrong, this initial point where the developers and designers can get so caught up in just the technology and the environment and the pixels and the that level of experience that there might be this initial time when they forget that the storyline, the characters, that's really important. And so here's my analogy. When this analogy may not make sense to people who are too young, but I'm going to use it anyway. When with computers, we went from character-based systems where all you could have was pixels on the screen and letters on the screen, and you made a box by putting a bunch of asterisks.
You reach a fork in the road. Do you turn left or right?
So and then we went to graphical user interfaces where now you had colors and you had more pixels and you could have shapes. And initially the stuff that came out was like we forgot everything we knew about how to design something well because everyone was so excited about having colors and shapes on the screen. And there was like a couple of years where, it's like, okay, it seems like we've almost gone backwards in terms of how useful or usable anything is. And then it's like, oh, wait a minute. All those things we used to know back when we didn't have all this stuff, that all applies, having things where people need them or want them, only having, the choices they want. And so eventually we adjusted. And I'm wondering if, initially in this VR space, we'll kind of forget some of the things we know about what's persuasive and engaging. and we'll just be into the leaves on the trees and the thunderbolts and the tornado and the all the action things happening, and forget that, wait a minute, you need a good story. Do you think that that's going to happen, or do you think that the people who are designing and developing this new VR stuff, they're coming from the previous world of games and ads, and they know to continue using that?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but having been now in the last year at a number of these conferences, as Guthrie suggested, I think they're taking cues from the video game world in which you're creating immersive 2D environments and putting those into the 3D. So I don't think we're going to go back to asterisks on the screen. But what we found in studying, at this point, hundreds and hundreds of short form stories, advertising, print layouts, is that the brain loves a good story. Story is, this is like, from Aristotle 2,300 years ago, but, a well-crafted story, your brain just loves it. It's almost optimized to engage the human brain. And a poorly crafted story, whether it's in VR, whether it's on a movie, doesn't really matter the medium. With all due respect to Marshall McLuhan, the mediums, the message is the medium. I guess that is Marshall McLuhan. Yeah, the medium is the message. No, it's the message that actually trumps the medium. So, I think a good story is a good story is a good story.
So I have an answer for you, Susan.
You do?
Yes, I do. And
okay, what?
And it's that. So back in your example that you gave, right? There was a couple years where people were just having fun and making things look pretty. But they didn't know that's not going to happen this time. So right now, especially with DirectX 12 and the Vulkan APIs that are coming out, it doesn't really matter. The point is that currently the way video games work is that the video game models actually render everything in 3 dimensions already. So it renders it in 3 dimensions. That's how you get the shadows and the shading and the particle effects. It's all rendered basically in 3 dimensions. And then it takes that 3-dimensional rendering and figures out what the user's camera angle is and then displays that in 2 dimensions. But at its core, at its base, video games are already designed to work in 3 dimensions. So in theory, the jump from taking a normal video game and then just having it also work in VR is probably a lot smaller leap than going from a text-based game to a game with graphics. So what you'll probably end up seeing is, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I don't know enough about the exact way that how you have to port games, but you'll probably start seeing normal video games that come out for Xbox and they come out for PC, but then they'll also work in virtual reality. And obviously the settings will be the same, and you might have to use a different rendering engine or something, but the essential essence of the game with the characters and everything, it'll just be able to port it to a new platform. So you're still, in order for the game to sell, it still has to be really good and good enough to compete against all the other games on PCs and on consoles.
Although I think, I understand what you're saying, and that's good. But I think also there's going to be a lot of people getting into VR not from the game world, from the advertising world, right? From other places. But all right, I have another question though, Paul. I want to take this into a slightly different direction because I want to ask you what you think about all this stuff and neuroplasticity. I'm thinking about some of the research I've been reading about reading.
Can you define neuroplasticity for our listeners, please?
No, yes, I will. Neuroplasticity is the idea that, okay. So maybe about 10, 15, 20 years ago, people pretty much thought that your brain developed when you were little, and then it stopped developing and essentially remained the same. And so your brain structures and what went on in the brain and how much of your brain was dedicated to this or that stayed the same. I mean, we used to make jokes about, oh, I got drunk last night, I killed brain cells. The idea being that you had this limited amount of brain cells, and things were wired a certain way, and they just then stayed that way from about puberty until you died, and it was all downhill. And then I don't know. I would say maybe, and Paul, please jump in and correct me with my approximate dates here. Maybe about 10 or so years ago, 15 years ago, we started to understand that the brain was a lot more flexible than we thought, and that there are some things that don't change at all or don't change very much, but that the brain has some capability of changing how it's working and what it's doing and what part of the brain is doing what. And so that the idea, for instance, I talk about reading because I think a lot of people who don't maybe haven't studied neuroscience, I know I meet a lot of people who, without really thinking about it, if you ask them, hey, is reading, kind of built into the brain, wired into the brain. So when you're born, somewhere in your brain, you have this part of the brain that's going to read, and it just, maybe take a couple of years to develop, but it's there. And the latest work is showing that no, there is no part of the brain that's dedicated to reading. Reading actually is a fairly new thing that humans have been doing. I mean, very few humans knew how to read even just a couple hundred years ago. And so to read, you actually are taking parts of the brain that were doing other things, and now they are dedicated to reading. And so that's the idea of neuroplasticity, that our brains can change based on what we are asking them to do. And so I'm wondering if Paul, I'd love to hear just what you think about neuroplasticity in general. And then I'm wondering, as we move into this world where we're starting now to, I'm kind of curious about whether we know anything about how our brain has reacted to video and movies. And then as we move into virtual reality, is our brain going to change if we spend significant amounts of time in virtual reality rather than physical reality?
These are really good and deep questions, and I think I'll give you a shot at the answer. I think we're still evolving. So, as you know, more neuroscience has been done in the last 10 years than was done in the previous 100 years. So we're just starting to get insights into this. But before we got online, we were talking, chatting, and I gave a talk yesterday in California, and I said, the two most important things that we've learned about the brain, particularly the human brain, in the last 10 years. Number one is that the brain is plastic throughout our entire life. It's constantly reshaping and remodeling. It does that through a variety of really interesting mechanisms. By the way, for listeners, the two most important ways to stimulate neuroplasticity, number one is exercise, aerobic exercise. Number two is enough sleep. So, all that stuff your mom told you when you were like in 8th grade, honey, get enough sleep and get some exercise. Turns out to be true. The second is, which I think is underappreciated, is the degree to which human beings' brain activity varies across individuals. That is, we think a lot about averages, but the dispersion around those averages is enormous. And when I teach my intro behavioral neuroscience course, my stealth reason for it, which I tell the students, towards the end, is you should have tolerance for people who are different than you, because everyone's brains are working differently, even in the same situations. They're working likely similarly, but when you measure brain activity for a living like I do, you just can't come away from the undeniable fact that I can put 20 people in this situation and I'm going to get 20 moderately different measures of brain activity for reasons that are super interesting and complicated. So I think, to answer your question, Susan, I think we're constantly running experiments on ourselves. We are just figuring out if the stuff we're doing is hurting us or helping us. And I think relative to VR, it can be a good or an evil depending on how it's deployed. I think there's increasing evidence, particularly for young people who spend a lot of time engaging in playing violent video games, that changes their threshold to respond to violence and perhaps to even commit violence. That's worrisome. On the other hand, really nice recent work has shown that individuals who spend time reading literature that has to do with understanding other people, empathy, that tends to increase people's sense of empathy, in the world in general. So as we're building these very, very rich virtual environments to engage in, and again, we have a history of doing that, movies, books for that matter, TV, we're moderately changing the way our brains react. So we can choose to use that for good or for ill. In my lab, we've done a lot of work using public service announcements. So how do we motivate people to not drink and drive, to not use drugs, to live a healthier lifestyle? And it can be done through effective storytelling and a kind of quote, people like us sort of ads. People like you and me do this kind of thing. And if I can tell that in a compelling way, then I can influence you short term and with increasing evidence in a longer term to adopt, appropriate behaviors. But if I want to teach you to be, I don't know, evil, aggressive, at the margins, I can probably do that. I can take people who are already a bit aggressive or have impulse control problems and accentuate that aggression in them. So, we have to be careful in these experiments.
Yeah, I think, there's, I kind of go back and forth and back and forth. I mean, on the one hand, I just get, I mean, underneath everything, I'm probably just a scientist. So I just get excited about, checking it out. What's this going to do? What's this going to do? And I love, I don't know if you know Paul, Marianne Wolf's work. She wrote about the reading in the brain, and she makes the comment because she says she thinks that the way we're reading now, for instance, the way we read online and the way we tend to scan and skim more online than if we're immersed in a narrative. And by online, she does not mean like ebooks versus physical books, although, she talks about the differences between those, but she's really talking more about, online content that's chunked and has headings and that kind of thing, rather than an immersive narrative. But, she says that that it's likely that as we change the way we read, it will change our brains, because learning to read, just the idea of reading has changed our brains, right? And back to that, this evolution. But she said, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just different. And she points out that back when, the printing press came out and people started reading, there were people saying this is going to be the end of civilization as we know it. If everybody's reading, right. It's going to change things so much that, this will be the end. And it did change things. And it has changed things, that people read. It's changed a lot, but not necessarily that it was the end of the civilization.
Right.
So, I go back and forth between, it's okay. We're changing, we're evolving. That's just the way it is. But then I spend a lot of time, especially these days, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about our role and responsibility, especially people who design and create stuff. I think it's getting more serious and more important as we create things. Guthrie and I are going to Stockholm tomorrow.
Actually. Yeah.
Tomorrow. I was going to say next week, and it's like, no, it's tomorrow.
Yeah, we get on a plane tomorrow.
And I'm going to be giving a talk on the future of human-computer interaction. And so I've been thinking a lot about, for instance, the design of sociable robots, and we have people who are going to be creating these interactions, and to me this is similar to people who are going to be creating the virtual reality experiences. What are they going to create? What kinds of interactions do we want to have? What kind of interaction do we want to have alone ourselves in a virtual world? What kind of interactions do we want to have with, sociable robots? I'm not sure, it's like so on the one hand, I'm excited about it. And on the other hand, it's like, well, we don't necessarily do a great job at having relationships with each other or with the other animals and plants that are in our physical world. I don't know that I have a lot of confidence that we'll always make good decisions about interactions in these virtual worlds.
I have a question. Go ahead. Sorry.
But I want to push back a little, Susan, on you, if I may. Based on experiments we've run, as you know from my book, we have this deep desire to socialize with others, and because of that, we want to be part of social groups. You have to behave appropriately, and so. This chemical that I was the first to discover affects things like trust and generosity. Oxytocin is a key modulator that tells us when we're behaving appropriately and how we connect to others, increases our sense of empathy. Although we, certainly slaughter a lot of cows to eat and other animals, we've been running experiments recently on animal-human interactions, and by and large, people are very, very kind to animals. These are healthy, Western, well-fed people. But our deeply social nature makes us care about more than just ourselves. Makes us care about even complete strangers, and extends to animals, and it might even extend to some plant life as well. So, I think the more we're immersed in other worlds, the more we get to experience the world from someone else's perspective.
Did you see? Oh, sorry, my apologies.
Sorry, just one more thought. The psychologist Steven Pinker at Harvard argued in his book that reading was one of the factors. Reading and subsequent empathy or understanding of other people is one reason for the radical decline in violence in the last 500 years in the world. So, I do think that there's. I don't know, maybe I'm just too much of an optimist, but there is this sort of innate desire for goodness in the human species, because even though the bad behavior gets all the press, it's the good behavior that keeps the world working in the right way. So I think there's going to be VR pornography, there's going to be VR violence, but I think for most people we're less interested in that than we are interested in understanding other people, other worlds, even other universes. Who knows? I'm sorry, Guthrie, go ahead.
So I have two questions. And I'm just gonna say both of them, then you guys can tackle them. The first is, so do you think, I was thinking about learning to read. What a waste of time that is. I know, like, we spend 2 years at kindergarten teaching these kids to read. Now they're learning important social skills. I'm not discounting that. But the reading part takes forever. Imagine every child, when they're 3, gets a VR headset that they strap on like 10 hours a day, and they're in a world where in order to do anything, they have to learn to read. Boom. Teach all the kids to read in 6 months in virtual reality. Does that haunt you, or is that awesome? Okay, that's question 1. Question 2, have you seen or heard about the research, and I don't know how, I read an article about it, I don't know if it's great research or where they had people touch a robot's butt and then they got sexually aroused.
All right, Guthrie, that is a strange collection of questions.
Well, the first one kind of came earlier and the second one came later.
Go ahead, Paul.
Go ahead, Susan. I'll take the butt one.
Oh,
There
good,
was
good.
recent study out of Duke showing that monkeys are very interested in other monkeys, particularly if they're higher status or if they're ovulating females, in particular focused on their butt. So it's called the monkey butt study, kind of got a lot of press. So yeah, that's probably valuable information. Um, uh, yeah, I wrote a blog for Psychology Today 5 years ago, at least 6 years ago, um, on robot brides. I think for people who are lonely, these effective robots, they're pretty darn good. I don't know if you've seen them, but
Getting better every year.
yeah. And so again, these brain systems are quite blunt, and we've done a fair amount of research on romantic relationships as well. And it's not like this is a fine-tuned system. It's presumably a system that didn't have a lot of selection pressure evolutionarily. And so yeah, people can fall in love. I mean, if you ever put down a dog, it's an awful experience. If that's your dog, man, it's the worst thing. I'm sure it's not as bad as losing a child or something, God forbid. But we really do get attached to things. So if we get attached to a dog and a robot who's even more responsive. So anyway, that's the variety of human experience, and I think we should just accept that there are some people who are going to prefer having robot husbands or brides, and others who will like the humans.
This is a the glass is half full kind of guy. You are definitely an optimist about technology. This is good. This is good. This is helpful because sometimes I think that I do get get a little dark, but you have a lot of I can tell you're going to have a lot more tolerance for some of the technology than
Paul. I'm with you. I'm in lockstep
with Paul.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So maybe I should stay the pessimist just to balance you guys out.
You should.
All right. Now
we're delusional, probably. So.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I wasn't going to say that, but I think you might be. No, but and then Guthrie, your question about reading. Wow, that's an interesting question. Reading, because I'm trying to think about in Marianne Wolf's book. She talks a lot about how people become readers and how they become fluent readers, and the fluency being very interesting, by the way. And Guthrie, we should probably, I don't know if we have this on the list. We should probably, do a podcast just about reading, and maybe we can see if Marianne Wolf would come on. But it's, she talks about the fact that when you are a fluent reader, meaning you can read and think about what you're reading at the same time, which is really interesting. That's the point. And she talks about the fact that when people read, they are having a richness of experience if they're fluent readers. Like they're reading and they're connecting that, what they're reading to what they know and what their experience has been. And Paul, I wonder if you've done any of your measurements while people were reading a story rather than, like watching a video. I'd be curious about what the difference in richness and engagement would be in that. But anyway, to get to that point, there's a lot that has to happen in the brain in terms of development of and it's essentially stealing parts of the brain that were doing other things and then allowing them to be used for reading. So I don't know, Guthrie, if immersing people in a virtual world and then they couldn't do things unless they learned to read, I'm not sure if that would help or not. I mean, it might. I think for some people, and who learn to read fairly easily, that's kind of what they're doing. They just want to be able to understand, the story that, for instance, the adult is reading them, and they want to be able to read it themselves, and so they are, they have that kind of motivation to keep going with it. And I believe in Marianne Wolf's book, she talks about the fact that the precursors to reading are so important. And yes, reading to a child is a precursor, but apparently a lot of talking is also a very important precursor to reading. So children who are talked to a lot have an easier time learning to read than children who are not.
So the thought is that if you can get kids in a virtual environment early, really early, like again 3 or 4, while their brains are still just developing, by doing that for a bunch of hours, you could very quickly and effectively, again, because you could be monitoring the responses the kids are having, so you could tailor it just so. You could very quickly develop a part of the brain that the brain could use for just that specific function. Again, reading was an example, but really it could be anything. So that by the time they hit school, their brain is already, like, you've done all the groundwork. So the brain, the parts of the brain that needed to be developed just to be able to excel in those areas, that groundwork is already done. So the kids can hit the ground running once they start learning.
Yeah, I think the cost of that, as Susan said, Guthrie, is, you have only so much brain area, and a lot of the area in the brain is multi-purpose. So one of my pet peeves in neuroscience is the word hardwired. So almost nothing outside of things like controlling your breathing and heart rate is hardwired in the brain. Everything else is soft-wired, so it responds to your environment. So I'm not sure you want to have sort of hyper-connected reading kids at 2 years old. There's a reason to allow these systems to develop at the pace they are. So, for example, the brain doesn't fully wire up actually until you're about 30. So in terms of what we call myelination, which is the insulation around the connections between neurons. So it might be too young. I think, again, we're running experiments on ourselves all the time. Mm-hmm. For example, we could do what you're talking about by giving kids amphetamines, and we're doing a lot of that for kids with ADD. And so we can increase prefrontal activity, more focus, but there are costs to that. It looks like, at least from an adult perspective, long-term amphetamine use has costs. So we're not really sure what that does to kids. So we are directing our own evolution, and that's the scary world. So now I'm going to move over to Susan's camp and say, it worries me a little bit.
Okay. Can I tell my own quick story about learning to read?
Sure.
It'll be real quick. I remember when I was learning to read, I was probably about 5, and I was a little bit of a late reader. But I remember very specifically, I knew how to kind of do letters. So, and I could kind of write words. And I remember having like 3 words. And I was trying to figure out how you put the words together. And the first thing that I did was I tried putting spaces between each word. And I remember thinking, that's stupid. That doesn't work. Okay, spaces are out. So then the next thought was, okay, I'm going to put lines, like break lines between each word, so that you knew when one word stopped and the next word started. And lines seemed a much better way to construct sentences. So that's what I went with. And then when they were like, this is how you read, I was very confused.
Well, this reminds me of what Paul said about everybody's brain is different. So.
Oh, Paul, just so you know, I have a strange brain. Susan does all kinds of brain stuff, and a lot of her talks she does various things so people can kind of see how their brain's working and what's going on. And like in a lot of them, I go the other way. I was like, which one is it, right? And like 99% of the people go, oh, it's this one, and I usually go the other way. So that this isn't really news to me.
Everyone's weird in their own way, and from a behavioral perspective, it's super cool that people have different brains and brains function differently. Again, if you had God forbid, you had a stroke and you couldn't move your arm, a good neurologist could tell you really quickly where that stroke occurred. but that you respond differently to words on a page than I do or Susan does. To me, that's just super interesting and cool.
See, we don't mind that you're weird, Guthrie.
Oh, thank you. I'm not weird. My brain is weird.
No, it's not weird. It's just you.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been amazing. I mean, Paul, I didn't know that we would be talking about smelling robot butts. I have to
Touching. It was touching.
touching. Okay,
Yes.
good. That's better. Anyway, that was a little far out there, but I've learned a lot. I'm gonna have to like think about all this stuff. What do you, Paul? Tell us before we wrap up here. What's like? I have two questions for you. First, what's kind of the next new exciting thing you think you might be working on in your lab? And then what's the thing you aren't working on yet, but that you wish you could?
And if you had any more thoughts about anything or had questions for us,
Yeah.
that too.
Boy, great questions. We're really working now on integrating across different consumer platforms. So really trying to understand how people go from an online user experience to advertising experience to an in-store experience, and integrating those across platforms. And we're developing some technology that lets us do that in I don't want to say seamless, but at least in a clean way, so we can really understand from a marketing perspective the sort of soup to nuts approach. People still are going to stores, and the competition for attention is obviously higher from a consumer's perspective. But anyway, we've been sort of digging away at that for a couple of years, and I think are making some real interesting progress, which interacts with your work on user experience. And the second is we're still doing a lot in the lab. We're still doing a lot of clinical work. We're actually making some progress now on some new assays for neurologic disorders or psychiatric disorders that have social deficits like autism and psychopathology, and developing new assays for that. So it's fun to have a foot in both worlds, where we get to take on difficult creative problems that potentially for consumers make their world much more interesting and exciting, and also continue to do hopefully fundamental research that can change clinical practice. Anyway, I've decided just not to sleep for the next 20 years of my life.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah,
Get all this done. So
Wait a minute. I thought you needed to sleep and you needed to have exercise.
Oh gosh, I did exercise this morning, so
All right.
I just do. Yeah.
And if you could work on something that you haven't had a chance to yet, what would you do?
Gosh, what a great question. Last year I think I went to 5 of the 7 continents. I want to run an experiment in Antarctica. I don't know why. I don't know what it's about, but I'm really interested in these individuals who can spend, particularly who can winter there. I think there's a special kind of brain like Guthrie's that really isolated with a small group of individuals and not freak out. So anyway, I want someone to send me down to Antarctica to run some kind of experiment that I'll figure out later on. I just think it'd be super cool to figure out what's going on down there.
Awesome.
Okay, I am not going with you on that one.
Come on, let's go together.
No.
I'll go to Antarctica.
Yeah, I knew Guthrie would say that. He'd go. Yeah.
I knew. I think I was acquaintances with someone who did, because I went to the University of Wisconsin, and they run a lab down there, so I knew.
Oh, really?
Yes.
You know someone who was down in Antarctica?
Yes, they did a shift down there.
Hook me up.
Oh, yeah. See, there you go.
Acquaintance. I'm not.
Oh.
It was a while ago too, but anyways, but that was apparently quite the trip.
All right. So before we go, Guthrie, you gonna have Paul tell us how people can get hold of him?
Yeah, I was just to say, if people want to listen to Paul do a lot more stuff, there's all kinds of great videos and stuff that he's done online. Paul, anything you want to plug?
Sure. Yeah, you can find out about our commercial work at zestxlabs.com. You can connect to me there. We're just doing the coolest stuff, I think, to really, again, quantify creative output, help creatives really understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and doing some work on movies now. There's a lot of stuff there you can dig around and play with, and lots of demos. So anyway, Zest X Labs, it's a fun site. You can see what we're doing.
And again, you can go check out our website. It's theteamw.com. If you have any questions or suggestions for future shows, email me at info@theteamw.com. Susan, what's your Twitter handle?
The Brain Lady.
The Brain Lady. If you happen to be in Sweden, we will be in Stockholm for the next couple days. So send me an email. We'll go get, I don't know, the herring. I'm not sure. We'll see what they eat in Sweden. Again, we're on all of the social marketing platforms. Paul, this is so great. If you ever want to do this again, just let us know.
Yeah,
thanks. You guys are wonderful. Well, what a ball this was. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. All right, and with that, I think we will end things. And to all those listening, thanks so much, and have a great week.